The ground didn't thaw the way it was supposed to. It was early April when the ground finally started to give. Not all at once, and not evenly. Some places held together longer than others, like they had something to keep. The yards went first, then the edges of the road where the snow had been thinner. By the second week, most of it was gone, sinking into the soil and disappearing, leaving the ground darker than it had been all winter. You could smell when it started to turn. Wet earth, old leaves, whatever had been sitting under the surface for months, pressed down and hidden, working its way back up once the cold let go. But the ground behind the houses stayed frozen. It always did. Past the fence line where the trees began to thicken, there was a stretch of earth that never seemed to thaw with everything else. Even when the air had turned, even when the rest of the town had moved on from winter, that part held on a little longer. It wasn't obvious unless you knew where to look. From a distance, it all blended together. The same dull color, the same uneven patches of ground. But up close, there was a difference. The surface stayed tight, unbroken, like it hadn't caught up yet. People noticed it in a way that people notice things without thinking about them much. A glance from a distance. A quiet assumption that there was a reason. There usually is. I hadn't thought about that place in years. Not since before the storm. There were 3 of us that year. We usually ended up in the same places after middle school without planning it. Sometimes later if there was still enough light. Behind the houses, past the last fence line where the yards gave out and the ground dipped slightly before the trees began. There was a stretch back there that felt separate from everything else. Not owned, not marked, and not really used for anything. It didn't belong to the houses, and it didn't belong to the road. That's where we went. It wasn't anything special. No trails, no paths worn in deep enough to follow without thinking. Just enough space between the trees to move through without brushing against every branch. If you went far enough, the houses disappeared behind you, and the sounds with them. In the winter, it was harder to get to. The snow built up unevenly. Some parts packed down into a hard surface that held your weight, and others gave way without warning. We never talked about it, why we went there, but we kept going anyway. Not every day, and not in an organized way, but often enough that it became something we expected without saying it. If one of us started heading that way, the others followed. It was quieter back there. Not silent, just less of everything. The sound of the road didn't carry the same way. Voices didn't travel as far. Even the wind felt different once it moved through the trees instead of over the open yards. Most of the time, we didn't talk much while we were there. That wasn't why we went. We mostly just moved around, kicking at the snow where it had been crusted over, breaking through thinner patches with the heel of our boot just to see how deep it went, following the same loose path through the trees without ever deciding on it. It was on one of those afternoons that we found it. There wasn't anything different about that day. No reason to remember it over any other. The sky was clear in the washed-out way it gets near the end of winter, where everything feels brighter than it should but still cold underneath. We had already been back there for a while, moving around and not doing anything in particular, just staying until it felt like time to leave. At first, it didn't look like anything. Just a place where the snow had sunk in slightly, near the base of the tree that leaned more than the others. The ground there had always been uneven, even before the freeze. It wasn't unusual to see dips or shallow shifts where something underneath had settled over time. Tommy stepped through it without noticing. The snow gave way more easily than it should have. Not deep, and not enough to fall, just enough to catch. He stopped and pulled his foot back, and looked down for a second as he was trying to figure out what had happened. Then he nudged the spot with the edge of his boot. The top layer broke apart more cleanly than the rest of the ground around it. Something darker showed through. Not soil or rock. It was something else. For a second, none of us said anything. We just stood there, looking down at the spot where the snow had broken apart. It didn't look like much at first. Just a darker patch beneath the surface, uneven at the edges where the top layer had given way. It could have been anything. Dirt pushed up from underneath. Something caught just below the freeze. Tommy nudged at it again with his boot. The rest of the surface cracked a little more easily this time. The snow split along a thin line and dropped away in small pieces, exposing more of whatever was underneath. It wasn't large, or buried deep either. Close enough to the surface that it shouldn't have been there without being noticed before. We all crouched down. No one said to. It just happened. Up close, it was easy to see that it wasn't part of the ground. The edges were too straight. Not sharp. They were worn down slightly, like they had been there for a while, but still straight enough that it didn't belong. Mike reached out and brushed the snow away with his hand. The movement was slow at first, like he was testing it, then a little quicker. The rest of us watched. The top cleared enough snow at a flat surface underneath. Dark, solid, not stone. Something else. Wait. It wasn't said loud, just enough to pause the movement for a second. He didn't stop completely, just slowed. The snow came away in uneven patches, sticking in places where the code still held. It took a little effort to clear it cleanly, more than it should have. When enough of it was exposed, we could see the rectangular shape, set into the ground at a slight angle, like it hadn't been placed carefully, more like it had been pushed in and left. No one touched it again right away. We just looked at it. It didn't make sense that it was there. Not in that spot, not close to that surface, not with nothing else around it. There weren't any marks nearby, no disturbed ground, no sign that anyone had been back there recently. Just the shape sitting under the snow like it had always been part of it. One of us shifted a little closer. "What do you think it is?" someone whispered. No one answered. He reached down again, this time brushing along the side inside the top, clearing away what was still packed against it. The edge came into view more clearly. It was metal. Dull, not reflective. Cold-looking, even where the snow had been cleared. No one said to open it. Not at first. We stayed where we were a few seconds longer, just looking at it like there might have been enough to understand what it was, but it wasn't. One of us reached out before anything had really been decided. Not all the way, just enough to touch the surface lightly, like he was checking if it was real. He pulled his hand back almost immediately, then returned again, more certain this time, brushing along the top where the last of the snow still clung to it. "Don't," someone said, though it didn't sound like much of an objection, just something to fill the space. He kept going. His fingers moved along the edge until they found the seam, pressing against it slowly, testing it the way you would test anything you weren't sure about. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a slight shift. Not enough to open it, just enough to feel that it could. He glanced back at us, like he was waiting for someone to stop him, but no one did. When he pressed again, a little harder this time, the seam gave with a dull, muted sound. It wasn't loud, but it carried in a way that made everything else feel quieter. That was the moment we should have stopped. Instead, the top lifted unevenly, catching slightly on one side before becoming free. He didn't open it all the way, just enough to look inside. At first, it was difficult to make anything out. The light didn't reach it cleanly, and whatever was inside sat lower than the edge, partially hidden in shadow. He leaned in slightly, angling his head to see past the lip of the opening. Then he stopped. Not suddenly, and not in a way that drew attention to itself. He just stopped moving. His hand stayed where it was, holding the top in place, as if he had forgotten he was the one keeping it open. The rest of us stepped closer without saying anything. Not close enough to touch it, but just enough to see. At first, it didn't make sense. The light wasn't reaching it cleanly, and whatever was inside sat lower than the edge, caught in shadow. It looked like a stack of something, thin and uneven, but not like anything we could name. We leaned in a little closer. The top piece shifted. It wasn't just paper. Not the kind we were used to anyways. It was thicker, folded in a way that didn't seem casual, like it had been handled more than once and then put back the same way each time. There were markings on it, lines, blocks of text, some of it typed, some darker, like it had been written over. Mike lifted it. Something beneath the stack caught the light for a second. Flat and glossy. It was a photograph. Only part of it showed at first. Just an edge. Then more as papers shifted slightly. It wasn't clear what we were looking at. Not immediately. He tilted it just a little more. It had been taken from far away. Far enough that whoever was in it didn't seem aware of it. The image wasn't clear. Not in the way it should have been. But there was enough there to know it wasn't random. He turned it slightly. Another photograph underneath. Then another. Not stacked loosely, just placed. Each one just beneath the last. He pulled the second free. Same stretch of ground. Same fence line. Same trees. All in the photo. Only this time, there was someone in it. Near the edge of the frame, turned slightly away. At first it didn't register. It was just a shape. Something familiar without a reason for it yet. He held the photo a second longer. Then, something small. Something that didn't belong to the distance. A detail. The way the jacket hung, the crease at the shoulder, the exact tear along the sleeve. No one said anything. He didn't need to turn it toward us. We already knew. Mike set it aside. He pulled the next one free. This one closer, the frame tighter now, the ground filling most of it. And there, 2 figures this time, standing where we stood, looking down at something just out of view, at the place where the box had been, at the place where it still was. No one reached in. No one moved to touch anything. We just stood there, looking at it longer than we should have, trying to make sense of something that didn't feel like it belonged to us. Put it back, someone said. This time, it sounded different. Quieter, but more certain. Nobody argued. We let the top fall closed. The sound it made was softer than before, but it carried just the same. For a second, none of us moved. Then one of us stepped back, and the rest followed. No one said anything for a while after it was closed. We moved away from the spot without really deciding to. The same way we had stepped toward it before. Just enough distance to not be standing over it anymore. The ground looked the same again. From a few steps back, there was nothing to mark where it had been. The snow had shifted when we moved around it, broken up into uneven patches, but nothing about it stood out. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't have looked twice. One of us kicked the edge of it, lightly at first, then a little harder. The top layer collapsed in again, covering part of it back up. No one said anything. We stayed there, not talking or moving much. Just standing around it like we were waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. After a while, one of us said we should just leave it. It sounded reasonable, like the kind of thing that didn't need to be argued with, but no one started walking. The problem wasn't being there. It was knowing what we had seen. You could leave and pretend it didn't matter, pretend it hadn't been clear. But it didn't feel like something you were supposed to forget, not after looking at it long enough to recognize it. No one said it, not directly, not in a way that made it real, but no one had to. One of us glanced back toward the houses, even though you couldn't see them from where we were standing. What if someone else finds it? No one answered right away. That was the first time it felt like a question, not about what it was, about what we were supposed to do with it. We didn't put it here, someone said. That didn't help. Another looked at the ground, at the place where it just sat under the surface now, partially covered again, but still there. Just cover it, one of us said. That was all. Not like a plan, just something to do. We didn't talk about it after that. We covered it without saying anything else, using our hands at first, then our feet when the ground started to give a little under the top layer. The snow packed differently there, breaking apart easier than it had before, like we had already loosened it enough to make it simple. It didn't take long, a few minutes maybe, less than that. By the time we were done, it didn't look like anything had been there at all, just another uneven stretch of ground. The surface pressed back into place as best as we could manage. We stepped back again, looked at it. No one said it looked right, but no one said it didn't. After a second, one of us turned and started walking. The rest of us followed. No one looked back. The storm came the night we found it. Not the kind that builds slowly or gives you time to think about it. It started sometime after dark and didn't let up. By morning, everything had been covered over again, clean and even in a way it hadn't been all winter. The roads were the first to go quiet, then the yards. By the time anyone went outside, there wasn't much left to see of what had been there the day before. The ground had been reset, smoothed out under a fresh layer that didn't show where anything had shifted or been disturbed. It looked untouched. School was closed the next day. No one said it had anything to do with the storm itself. It was just what happened when there was enough snow all at once. It made everything stop for a little while. We didn't go back. Not that day, not the day after. There wasn't a conversation about it. No one said we shouldn't. We just didn't. There were other places to be when the roads opened again. Other things that took up the time that would have been spent behind the houses. It was easier that way. The snow stayed longer back in their spot than it did anywhere else. Even as the rest of the town started to clear, that stretch held on to it. Packed down, hardened, settled in over itself until it didn't look like something you could move through easily anymore. From a distance, it didn't stand out. The surface stayed tight and unbroken, like it had been left alone long enough to forget anything had been under it to begin with. Weeks passed. The storm turned into winter again for a while, then slowly into something else. The days stretched out, the light changed, and the snow started to pull back the way it always does. Unevenly, in patches, leaving some places exposed and others buried longer than they should have been. We all saw each other, but not like before, and not in that place. It was never something we agreed on. No one said we were avoiding it, but if one of us started heading that way, the others didn't follow. If it came up at all, it was in the form of something else, another place, another direction, something easy to move toward. It didn't feel like we were forgetting about it. It felt more like we were leaving it where it was. It took years before I thought about our spot again in a way that stayed. Not all at once and not clearly, just in pieces. A place, a feeling, something that didn't sit right once everything else had moved on. By the time April came back around that year, most of it was gone. The snow pulled back the way it always does, slow in some places, faster in others, leaving behind patches that didn't seem to follow any pattern. The yards cleared first, then the roads. The edges of everything softened as the ground started to take it back in. It didn't all change at once. Some parts held longer. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was where. Behind the houses, past the fence line, the ground stayed frozen longer than it should have. Even as everything around it began to give, that stretch held on to the cold. The surface still tight and unbroken in a way that didn't match the rest of the area. It wasn't something you would notice right away, not unless you went back there. I hadn't planned to. It was something I thought about often, not in a way that stayed with me. But there are certain things that don't need to be remembered clearly to still be there. They came back when something else shifts. The air had changed just enough to make it feel like winter was finally over, even if it wasn't completely gone yet. The kind of day where things felt normal again. Or close enough to it. I ended up back there without deciding to. The path wasn't marked, but it didn't need to be. It was still the same as it had been, just familiar enough that your feet knew where to go without thinking about it. The trees hadn't changed. The ground hadn't either. At least not at first. From a distance, it looked the same as everything else. The same dull patches of earth, the same uneven surface where the snow had melted away. Nothing stood out enough to stop you. Up close, it was different. The surface was too smooth. Not flat, not clean. Just settled in a way that didn't match the rest of the ground around it. Like it had been pressed back into the place and left that way. I stopped a few steps short of where I thought it should be. For a second, I wasn't sure. The tree was still there, the one that had leaned slightly more than the others. The ground dipped in the same way it always had. Everything lined up the way it should have, except for the surface. It didn't look disturbed. That was the problem. It should have. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to match what I was seeing to what I remembered. The snow had come and gone. The ground had shifted. Time had passed. That was enough to explain it. or it should have been. But there was something about the way it sat there, unchanged in the wrong way, that made it hard to leave. I didn't step any closer, and I didn't kneel. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, looking at a place that should have meant nothing anymore, and knowing it didn't. I went back once more before the ground had fully settled. Not that same day, not right away. Long enough that it could have been explained as something else, if I had needed a reason. The air had warmed a little more by then. The last of the snow had started to give in places it had been holding on to longer. The ground felt softer underfoot. It was uneven and less certain. Nothing had changed on the way in. It was the same path, the same trees, the same quiet that settled in once the houses dropped out behind you. It should have felt familiar. It didn't. I stopped in the same place as before, a few steps back. The surface looked the same, too smooth, too settled, like it had been left alone long enough to become something else. I waited there a while without really deciding what I was going to do. Then I stepped forward. The ground didn't give the way I expected it to. It held. It wasn't frozen or hard. It was just firm in a way that didn't match the rest of it. I stood over the spot looking down at it the same way we had before. Only now there was no one else there. No one to say anything. No one to stop. No one to follow. Just the place. And the memory of what we had left in it. For a second, I thought about leaving. The same way we had before. Just turning and walking back the way I came. I didn't. I stayed where I was a little longer, looking at a place that didn't look like anything anymore. Then I stepped back. As I did, the ground shifted. Not much, just enough to notice. A slight settling under the surface, like something giving way deeper down where I couldn't see it. I froze for a second, listening, though there wasn't anything to hear. The surface stayed the same, unbroken, still. I waited. Nothing happened. After a while, I turned and walked back the way I came, not looking down again, not stopping until the trees had thinned out and the houses came back into view. I didn't go back after that. Not in that spring, not later, not at all. But I still think about it sometimes. Not what it was, just that it's still there.